The Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria in 1897 celebrated national and imperial unity and marked the middle of a period when the world was radically transformed. It was the climax of Britain's campaign to lead and dominate Europe in the race for empire, to be the rightful heir to all the glories and the benefits of the great civilizations of the past. At Portsmouth, after the pomp and ceremony, the attendant kings and queens, princes, heads of state and dignitaries were all treated to a display of British naval power. If any of them needed it, here was a reminder of how Britain had won her empire and how she intended to keep it. 4 short years later, Queen Victoria was dead. But the spirit of her age, one of robust self-confidence and overweening national pride, lived on, not just in England, but everywhere in the Western world. Between 1870 and the beginning of the First World War, in both old Europe and new America, the world changed out of all recognition, faster than ever before, and perhaps even faster than at any time since. In that period, the peoples of Europe became better fed, better housed, better educated, better governed, better defended. Their forms of government, in the shape of empires, spread all over the globe. By 1900, non-European civilizations had, to a large extent, succumbed to European domination. The British Empire took up almost a quarter of the world's surface, including the great land masses of India, Canada, and Australasia. The French Empire had taken over West Africa and some of Southeast Asia. The Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Dutch, the Belgians, the Germans, the Italians, the Danes, the Ottomans, and the Russians. All of them governed subject peoples and assumed it was their right to go on doing so. London controlled the greatest of the world's empires, and London governed the Queen's imperial possessions with autocratic dignity, handling the native populations with a finely tuned balance of force, coercion, and concession. Yet the concepts of political liberty shared by the Americans and the Republican French, who gave America the Statue of Liberty, were also respected in England. The power and prosperity of the West came largely from the creation in the second half of the 19th century of political communities and economic systems that were both stable and secure. Money was safe. There were parliaments to ensure that governments did not arbitrarily steal it, and there was a gold standard to make sure that it kept or increased its value. The pound sterling and the franc germinal offered a fixed rate of exchange, valid all over the world, at a time when most Americans were still dealing in quids, or lumps of tobacco. At the heart of industrial progress after 1850 was a solid and rapidly expanding banking system centered upon London. With the development of oceanic cables and transcontinental telegraph wires, the banking system could, at a moment's notice, link London with Yokohama or San Francisco, and potential purchasers of tea, coffee, or grain could compare prices worldwide. Vast new territories were placed under cultivation to supply Europe with food grown with the help of new agricultural machinery. The farmers of the Argentine, Australia, Russia, Hungary, and especially North America competed to undercut each other in price and outproduce each other in quantity. From the 1860s onwards, the amount of grain reaching Europe from overseas rapidly increased. Even the poor kingdom of Italy increased its import of grain 20-fold between 1880 and 1887. The spread of the railways in North America forced food costs down worldwide. In 1874, it cost 23 cents to take a bushel of grain from Chicago to New York. By 1881, it cost only 14 cents. Shipping prices fell in the same years by a factor of 10 on the transatlantic run between New York and Liverpool. The result was that food prices fell fast. In England, a loaf of bread, which had taken up a very large part of the working class weekly income in 1870, took up a very small part of it by 1904. For the first time, Europeans were, for the most part, free from want. They could feed themselves adequately and still find money in their pockets. This gave rise in both Europe and America to the growth of service industries. Surplus cash was spent on pleasure and amusement, on holidays and housing, clothes, ornaments, and transport. The age of the consumer had begun, and to meet the new demand, new industries spilled out new sorts of goods in unparalleled profusion. Old-fashioned craft and rural industries gave way to a factory system based on coal, iron, and steam power, which churned out locomotives, rails, barbed wire, tools, and new consumer goods. Coal output in Europe rose from 173 million tons in 1871 to 594 million tons in 1914. In the United States, growth was even faster. The value of its manufactured goods increased 33 times between 1860 and 1914. Most important of all was a revolution in technology. Spurred on by British inventiveness, the new industries adopted the latest techniques, applying science and the machine to processes that had always been completed by hand. From the great industrial cities of America to the newly discovered oil fields of Russia, technology assumed a momentum and an importance that changed the way people lived. Invention followed invention, each one pushing the economies of the industrialized nations further forward. The first airships, pioneered in Germany, where their military significance was not overlooked, were a symbol of the new era. Count Zeppelin's invention, this type of airship, first flew in 1900, and between 1910 and 1914, Zeppelins pioneered air passenger travel. In America, in 1900, the Wright brothers tinkered their way into history with the first successful flying machine that was heavier than air. Few people, including the Wright brothers, would have backed this mechanical monstrosity to outlast the elegant airships. Inventiveness was fueled by oil and by the accumulation of economic power and capital. Standard Oil in America, founded by John D. Rockefeller, bought up almost all its smaller rivals and controlled 95% of the American oil business by 1905. John Pierpont Morgan built up the largest trust in the world in iron and steel, banking, railroads, and shipping. In Germany, industrialists such as Alfred Krupp were doing much the same thing. The coming of industry transformed Western society. In the 1860s, most people had lived in villages or on farms. By 1914, more people lived in towns and cities, and in the United States there were 35 cities with populations of more than 100,000 people. The greatest transformation came in England, whose rural workforce declined to a mere 10% of the working population over the 19th century. But perhaps the most striking example of the exodus from the country came across the Channel in Germany, where the transformation was squeezed into a generation. As Germany industrialized, the number of major cities rapidly grew, until by the early 1900s there were nearly 30 with populations exceeding 100,000 people. The traditional peasant world shattered into fragments as people poured into the cities to feed the new factories with their labor and to purchase its products with their surplus wages. Mechanical novelties of all sorts fascinated journalists, writers, and thinkers, and quickly persuaded adults and children to part with their pennies. New fashions such as Christmas trees, introduced to the English-speaking world by Prince Albert, and the craze for novelty were spurred on by the advertisers, tradesmen, and manufacturers who stood to gain from the growth of an urban population intent on carefree consumption and who were ready to travel to seek enjoyment and work. The rapid growth of cities was accompanied by a revolution in Europe's social structure. A new middle class emerged, committed to servicing and managing modern industry, anxious to rise up the social scale, intent on improving and modernizing the cities. This new middle class gradually came to dominate urban life, which itself was undergoing a change with town planning and the introduction of new roads and railways. This change affected the old aristocracy, which moved away from agriculture into manufacturing, mining, and banking. It was in the cities that literacy and universal education became the norm. This was the great age of the school and of the university. Many people who were mobilized or displaced by these changes were not satisfied with the city life of the new urban European proletariat. Over 40 million people left Europe between 1850 and 1914. Most of them headed for Canada, the United States, and to Latin America. Wherever the European immigrants went, they brought with them a new sort of dynamism, often born of desperation, and the trappings of the new economic order. Chief of these was the railway. Railways were relatively cheap to build and brought instant dividends in opening up new areas for economic exploitation and for settlement. From less than 5,000 miles of track, mostly in Britain and the USA in 1850, the railways grew until there were almost 500,000 miles in 1870, 176,000 in Europe and 223,000 in North America. Throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the railways were the arteries that brought European trade and European culture into new territories and began to break down the isolation and the independence of old societies. Almost as significant was the steamship, making possible a vast increase in the speed and sheer quantity of transoceanic communication. It was these advances which brought Europeans to a position where they could explore, exploit, and dominate the globe. It was at this time that trade became truly international. Goods of all sorts could be marketed and distributed effectively and quickly throughout the world. 2/3 of the world's shipping carried commodities by 1914, and the bankers and the financiers who organized all this, and especially those from the City of London, amassed great profits. In 1870, large areas of the globe were under the control of one European power or another. But the increasing rivalry among them, the demand for ever more raw materials to feed industry, and vast improvements in transport and communications meant that by 1914 almost no part of the world remained untouched, unconquered, or uncontrolled by Europe. The new imperialists seemed to see the world as an endless Aladdin's cave of resources, which the Europeans believed themselves entitled to control, to plunder, and exploit. Spurred on by a mixture of greed and sheer curiosity, Europeans brought their dominant culture and technology to bear wherever they could, in all the other continents of the world. It also served to aggrandize the crowned heads of Europe, who saw in empire a means of regaining their historic glories. The economic incentives, too, could be considerable. Investment abroad made millionaires of many. These share certificates for oil speculations in Russia were printed in 4 languages. Risk capital, like commodities, technology, and armaments, had become wholly internationalized. Not all the areas that were good for trade or investment became colonies. Indeed, the countries of Latin America had only recently shaken themselves free of Spanish and Portuguese domination, thanks to British and American help. Now, in many cases, they exchanged one kind of dependence for another, as they came under the economic influence of those same countries that had helped free them from their old oppressors. At that time, the world's economic system was based on gold, and the gold strikes in Australia and South Africa, in the Yukon and Siberia, brought a rush of settlers and pioneers. The world's stock of gold doubled between 1889 and 1904, and oil also brought windfall profits for Britain in Persia and Burma, for Russia in Baku, and for many speculators in the United States. The scramble for raw materials and commodities of all sorts propelled the race to acquire new colonies and imperial possessions. Even the most unpromising terrain could be transformed by railways and modern irrigation into new plantation colonies like Kenya or Nigeria. Here, crops like tea, coffee, cotton, tobacco, sisal and cocoa could be grown at great profit. This imperial prosperity and enterprise was at the heart of the outburst of national pride which occurred in London at the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. Englishmen, in particular, took a great pride in their imperial traditions. They cherished an idea of themselves as a superior race, with a moral right to power over coloured peoples. If you were an Englishman in India, however insignificant, you counted as a member of the master race, and your slightest wants were attended to. European imperialists assumed that the empire brought enlightenment and civilization to the native societies that they ruled, and that therefore they had a right to be there. The English writer Rudyard Kipling encapsulated this spirit with his phrase, "the white man's burden." And the Queen Empress Victoria was herself a symbol of Britain's imperial success. Meanwhile, Britain's prosperity was believed to depend on the continuation of the imperial crusade, and Britain's rivals in Europe began to contest Britain's right to the largest empire the world has ever seen. In addition, the subject peoples began to organize themselves in opposition to the imperialists. Japan adapted very quickly to the challenge and resisted pressure from Europe, Russia, and the United States. Under the new regime launched by the Meiji Restoration of 1868, the Japanese set about modernizing Japan along Western lines. In 1905, Japan had defeated Russia and was reinvigorated as a trading and industrial power. Later, she began to spread her own form of imperialism throughout Southeast Asia. However, Japan's success was the exception. In most other areas, there were widespread revolts and disturbances. On the whole, these were successfully contained. The European powers and America had vast economic resources and unquestioned military superiority, while Russia successfully expanded into the Asian territories to the south and east during the last half of the 19th century. They took territory from the Chinese and defeated the Muslim Khanates, the last remnants of the Tatars. Their ancient capital, Samarkand, fell in 1868. Similarly, in the United States, the Plains Indians under Sitting Bull were finally defeated in 1876, and the Midwest up to the Rockies opened up for white settlement. The abolition of tribal ownership of land 10 years later dealt the final blow to the North American Indians. In Africa and elsewhere, the West's superior military technology made it relatively cheap and easy to conquer and to hold new territory. Any attempts at resistance were ruthlessly suppressed, even in North Africa, where a jihad, or Muslim holy war, was declared against the invading white Christians. The greatest non-Christian empire, that of the Ottoman Turks, also found it impossible to resist the power of the Europeans. The Ottomans were stripped of their North African empire by Britain, France, and Italy, and were then placed under great pressure in Iraq. In China, by the beginning of the 20th century, the 250-year-old Qing dynasty was in the last stages of decay. Efforts to modernize it were resisted by the Manchu mandarins, who still attempted to keep the Europeans at arm's length. But the European powers were confident that China was a vast potential market for their goods. And they jostled with each other for special trade treaties at Peking, Shanghai, Fuzhou, Hong Kong, and other major ports. Chinese nationalism and anti-European feeling came to a head during the so-called Boxer Rebellion of 1900 around Peking, which was eventually put down by a combined European and American force. The disgrace to the old empire was insupportable, and the last Qing emperor abdicated in 1912. A revolutionary force, later called the Kuomintang, led by Sun Yat-sen, began to rally the forces of Chinese nationalism. The disintegration of virtually the whole non-European world sharpened appetites in Western Europe. True, Europe was more prosperous than at any time in the past, but a mass society had now been created in which the electorate could best be galvanized into political action by appeals to national pride couched in more and more hysterical terms. It seemed an obvious answer to the problems of poverty in the Western world to exploit the Eastern world more effectively. The problems of the teeming factory civilization in the towns could be solved by the export of proletariats to the new empires. In this way, it became common even for liberals to support the development of national power, the build-up of armaments, and the constant pressure within the European nations to compete for imperial possessions. The feudal energies of the past were synthesized with the industrial energies of the present. Splendidly equipped cavalry still symbolized Prussian strength, but it was Krupp's industrial empire which underpinned Prussian power. For a European state to reach out for an overseas empire in the face of British naval strength, great ships were a necessity. Great Britain built up a huge navy in the 1890s, and in response, Germany built up an enormous navy as well as a vast army. The Russians followed suit and became the allies of the French to threaten and to contain Germany. Austria was Germany's ally, and Germany connived at its attempts to control the Balkan states and build up its own small empire in that area. When the heir to the Austrian imperial throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in the Balkans on the 23rd of June 1914, the whole network of alliances, mutual jealousies, and imperial tension exploded. After 1914, the world could never be the same again.